So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about, what is mistletoe doing in your tree, but also what is it doing in your house and why do we hang it for Christmas, which is truly a mystery, and the mystery and the history of mistletoe, kind of, continuing Doug's presentation earlier about the history of the Christmas tree. We're going to be talking about the history of mistletoe as well as what it means for your trees. So here's a photo of what you might see in your trees, especially this time of year. It really sticks out because mistletoe is evergreen. So when your trees lose all of the rest of their leaves, the mistletoe will be there all year round. But this time of year is when you really notice it because it's lost everything else. It's lost the other leaves in its canopy. Most of our trees are deciduous. And what you've got are some hidden mistletoe that are still there. And as you can see in this picture, I mean, they are embedded in that branch. So here's the branch of the tree, and you can see this mistletoe, this other plant that's living inside and intertwined with that plant. So they are parasitic. They are parasites of trees in our area. And they have these thick, fleshy leaves that have a distinctive texture. They'll have small white berries, and where they are growing, there's a swelling of the branch there. If you were to cut through that, you'd see mistletoe tissue, a bright, yellow-green color that's kind of embedded in there with the tree's wood as well. And how do they get there to begin with? They're not growing in the ground like most plants you think of. Birds eat those white berries and spread those seeds to new trees. While those birds are sitting in those trees, if they happen to deposit some of those seeds, those can germinate and penetrate the bark of that tree, actually getting into the vascular system of that tree, the roots of the mistletoe. The mistletoe that we have here in Kentucky is the one in the picture here. It's called leafy mistletoe. And it's also the one that you might hang in your doorway this time of year. And it's leafy because for a mistletoe, these leaves are kind of large and green. And that's significant because they're green, right? So what does that mean? It means that this plant, despite being parasitic, is photosynthesizing. It's getting its own energy from the sunlight. And while it is taking some things from the host tree that it's on, it's getting water, it's getting different nutrients from that tree. It's not entirely dependent on it. So it's a parasite, but it's what we'd call a hemiparasite, like not as bad as other parasitic plants that are out there, which is notable for us in terms of what's the impact that this is having. So if you think about it, most normal plants would get water and nutrients from the soil that they're growing in, and instead mistletoe has these structures called sinkers that are embedded into the branches and the tissues of trees, and they steal water and nutrients that way. But for the most part, they're really not too bad for trees, our leafy mistletoe, that is, because while they're taking some water, some nutrients, they aren't taking as much energy. They're photosynthetic, so they're producing energy as well. And it could be an issue, let's say, if a tree is totally covered with mistletoe, like in this picture here, you can see this tree has lots and lots of mistletoe, and we were in a major drought or something, or maybe it could increase a tree's risk of wind throw because you've got that leafy mass up there in the canopy during the winter, or ice storm damage. But in general, since mistletoe, our leafy mistletoe, makes its own energy, it isn't draining trees that much. So that's a good news, right? What's bugging your tree? Fortunately, with mistletoe in our area, not that big of a deal. But there are other parasitic plants, and there are other mistletoes in different parts of the world that can be more damaging to trees. So just a few that you might have seen, this is dodder, which can be an agricultural pest. There are dwarf mistletoes, which are a major problem, especially in conifers on the western US. And these might not be photosynthetic at all. They might get all of their energy from their host plant. And that's a much bigger drain on that plant than our leafy mistletoe. So just something to think about there. Mistletoe grows on a wide range of different hardwood trees in our area. You can see it on oaks, on walnuts, on lots of different species. And what to look for? Well, this time of year it really sticks out in the winter, but it's kind of got this ball shape to it, this nice rounded shape to it. And I think it's kind of beautiful if that's what you're looking for. Now, other people might see this and be concerned about the health of your tree. But again, good news, because it's typically not a major issue. And while we don't really want mistletoe in our trees all of the time, especially if you're thinking about that tree, it does play an ecological role. It produces flowers and berries in the wintertime at a time when most other plants in our area aren't doing that. So birds can feed on those berries and they can be a great source of nutrients for them. But a note that these berries are considered toxic to humans and not something you want to mess with. But while this is a really familiar sight in our area, I mean, you've probably seen lots of mistletoe growing in trees and can now breathe a sigh of relief that it's not really doing much damage. There is this mystery of, how did we get our traditions surrounding mistletoe? And if you look around online and in other resources, you can find some fascinating stories about the history of mistletoe, the mythology that's there. And I think some of it goes back to Norse mythology. So in Norse culture, mistletoe was a sign of love and peace. There's a story about the goddess Frigg and her son Baldur having been killed by an arrow of mistletoe. And after his death, she vowed that mistletoe would be associated with love and never again used as a weapon. And so in Norse mythology, it had this kind of connection to love. And, that kissing tradition comes from there. Druid priests valued it, and it was a sacred plant to them as well. And, worth noting that in Europe, they also have a leafy mistletoe that's very similar to ours, but has a slightly different shape, and a shape that perhaps more is connected to its fertility aspect, as parts of the plant might have some semblance to human anatomy and that connection to fertility. So just kind of some background on those ancient uses of mistletoe. But then we get into, how did mistletoe get tied to Christmas, which is a totally separate story and a somewhat surprising one. As Doug mentioned earlier with the Christmas tree, this wasn't always the case. And I think it came about during a time when lots of these older traditions were being revived and connected to Christmas from the Druids in the 18th century and 19th century. These traditions are kind of reborn in that Christmas context. So maybe we got the tradition of kissing under the mistletoe from that old Norse legend and the connection of mistletoe being about love and peace. But whatever it was, it became immensely popular in Britain and spread from there into other parts of the British Empire and the English-speaking world. This was picked up in the popular media from stories, from cards, and of course, with the advent of television through that as well. And now this is a tradition around the world. So whatever the reasons for its popularity, the next time you see some mistletoe in your trees, you might think differently about it. I think, going back to those old Norse traditions, it certainly does kind of inspire some happiness this time of year when all of the other trees have lost their leaves. To see something in the tree that still is green and still has its leaves, definitely a sign of life during an otherwise kind of dreary time of year. So with that, thanks for joining me for some history on the mystery of mistletoe.